Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Zero Lives Left podcast. My name is Wayne Denner. I'm delighted to be your host today. We are going out live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. We are talking about a fantastic topic in today's podcast. So if you do have any questions as we're moving through this information this morning, please do pop them into the chat. And we're going to pick those questions up as we move through our content this morning. Now, we are talking about all things podcasting, which is a topic that I absolutely love. I am a creator of my own podcast. You are maybe already a listener of that podcast, the Zero Lives Left podcast. And I have been hosting that podcast now for over 5 years, producing well over 60 episodes of the podcast. And of course, I'm also a guest on other podcasts as well, right across the world. I love to do live LinkedIn audios, but I'm always looking for new opportunities to learn. And the podcasting world is evolving all the time with new platforms, with new technology, and also the all important tools when it comes to podcasting. What tools do you actually need? Well, I have got a man joining me on this episode of the podcast today. I am talking to none other than Roger Gowdy, who's going to talk all about his experience and expertise in the world of podcasting. Roger, good morning. You are very welcome joining me on this episode of the podcast. And we're going to talk all things podcasting. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of podcasting, what it's all about, why one should even want to invest any time in podcasting, give our listeners a little bit of a backstory on your journey to date.
Sure. Well, good morning, Wayne, and thank you very much for inviting me on. Pleasure to talk all things geekery with you, as always. Yes, my name's Roger, and I'm a podcast nerd. I would put yourself in that category too, Wayne. I suppose my journey with podcasting goes quite far back. I've always been a bit of an audio visual nerd, anything cameras, microphones, loved all that. And then I did a degree in Queen's University called Sonic Arts, which sounds fancy, but it's really about the kind of science of sound and acoustics and recording and microphones and all that stuff. And I did that in 2005, which happened to be the year after podcasting was invented. So a lot of people are surprised to hear that podcasting goes back to 2004. And in 2005, Apple integrated podcasts into their iTunes software. So whenever I got my student loan in, I went out and bought myself a third generation iPod, which was white. It was beautiful with backlit buttons and a little scroll wheel. And whenever I opened it up and turned it on, there was this item in the menu called podcast. And I thought, what on earth is a podcast? So that was way back then, nearly 20 years ago now. And I was hooked then, and I've kind of been hooked ever since. Originally as a listener, listening to lots of podcast content, but then in later years, getting into producing, a little bit of hosting, and now in consultancy and training, helping other people get started in podcasting too.
Fantastic. And I get those questions from time to time from people, how did you get into podcasting? What was the motivation? How do you even get started? And people are, always looking for new ways to get their business message out there or their brand message out there. And podcasting actually presents a very unique opportunity to do that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. But let's say we've got somebody listening into the podcast today, what we're talking about, maybe they listen to a number of podcasts themselves and they thought, what, I've got a fantastic idea for a podcast. And they've sort of sat down, they've fleshed out some ideas on paper, they've thought about the why, the what, and then the who. How does one actually get started? And this is something I remember back in 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when I launched the Zero Lives Left podcast. I remember it was around Christmas time. I can remember it very clearly. I had been listening to some podcasts and I thought, you know what, I'm going to go and I'm going to look up some information on how to actually get started.
Yeah.
And I realized pretty quickly it was a bit of a minefield
Yes.
because there's so many parts to consider, right? There's the obvious ones like the microphone, there's the obvious ones like recording of the said audio.
Yeah.
But give us a little bit of an overview, Roger, into the equipment that one might require to actually kick something like this off.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it can be a bit of a minefield, and I think it's probably getting more like that as more and more products get released onto the market, and it's kind of a bit overwhelming. But you kind of glossed over a little phrase there. You said whenever people have worked out the why, the who, and the what of their podcast, and I think that actually before you even get to buying equipment, there's a lot you need to think about. And I think because the barriers of entry to podcasting are so low, quite often people rush in and go, oh, I'll get my microphones and I'll just start putting content out there. So yeah, I will definitely share about the equipment you can get, but I would love to spend a wee bit of time actually on that little bit about, people, getting your podcast concept ready, because um, in my training I talk about the foundational building blocks of podcasting, which are those three questions: those the who, the what, and the why. And the why is really important, because why are you going to podcast as opposed to YouTube or TikTok or any other kind of, or blog or any other form of content generation, and really know why you're doing that. What would success look like for you? What are you trying to achieve? And then what is your idea? And like you, I probably sit in lots of Facebook groups and forums, and I see people coming on saying, I'm starting a new podcast," and people go, "Great, what's it about?" And they say, "Oh, well, it's me and my friend, and we talk about relationships and investment advice and tech and life." And I think, oh, my heart sinks, because I think, oh, that's so hard to make. That's so hard to make a success out of that, because they haven't really found their niche. They haven't really focused in on that idea. And so I just think it's really important to really get your podcast idea nailed down. What exactly is it that separates your podcast from anyone else's? Can you say it in 10 words? That's a really good test. Can you put your podcast idea in 10 words or less that describes nothing else but your podcast? And then there's the who. Who's your audience? And quite often at that stage, people say, everyone would love my podcast. But the truth of the matter is that if everyone likes it, then probably no one loves it, because it's too generic. So who would love your podcast? Who would actually lap up that content because it's just for them? And I also do this exercise called the ideal listener avatar, where you picture your audience as one person, and start, give them a name. Let's call him Jeff, whatever. And what is Jeff? What does he do? Where does he live? What's his job? What other content does Jeff like? And then you aim your content at your ideal listener avatar, and it helps get you really focused and really consistent, which is really important when it comes to the podcasting. But let's assume then you've got all that nailed. You've got your concept down. So what equipment do you need? And this is one of the brilliant things about podcasting. You need very little. Technically, you could just use your smartphone and get started. You could do it. I would probably not advise it. If you have any kind of budget, I would recommend getting a podcast mic. You don't need to spend loads of money. The one I recommend quite often is the Samsung Q2U. You can look that up. It's about 75 to 95 pounds on Amazon, depending on what pricing they decide to choose in any one day. That's a USB mic. It just plugs straight into your computer. And if it's only you doing like a solo podcast, or if it's you and you're interviewing guests that are remote, i.e. not in the same room as you, then a USB mic is perfect. Just plug it in and away you go. Or if you need more than one microphone, if you've got a co-host with you in the same space, or you're recording with a guest in the same space, then you're going to need more than one microphone. You're going to need a microphone each. And in that case, you'll need what's called an XLR microphone. It's kind of the traditional type of microphone. It's got 3 pins at the bottom. And then you also need what's called an audio interface, something to plug those microphones into, which then that audio interface will then plug into your computer. So that's where it kind of gets a wee bit complicated for people. But the basic rule is, if it's just you on your own, you don't need any other microphones. A USB microphone, just plug it straight in, great. If you need more than one microphone, you need XLR microphones and an audio interface. Or we were just talking before we went live there, you have a fancy little device called a PodTrack. You can, yes, hold it up, there it is. That's what's called an external recorder. You can bypass your computer altogether if you want and record into an external recorder. That's really good because you're not relying on your computer not crashing at any particular time, and it's also just a bit more mobile. And that records your audio straight onto like a little memory card, and then your digital audio files are ready then to pop into your computer and edit from there. So that's the kind of hardware, if you like. And then when it comes to software, a lot of people start with Audacity, which is free. It's recording and editing software, and it's for PC or Mac. Or if you're a Mac user, GarageBand comes with your Mac and it's free. And there are other ones you can pay for, like Adobe Audition or Hindenburg, or there's different ones. But the free ones have basically everything you need to get started. So it's really not that complicated. As with all these things, there's a bit of a learning curve, but it shouldn't hold anyone back from getting stuck in.
Now, just before we take a step back in a couple of moments, I just want to say if you have any questions, you're listening into this episode on LinkedIn or indeed anywhere else, YouTube or Twitter, and you've got a question for Roger this morning, please do pop it into the chat. We can pick those questions up as we move through our talk and our conversation this morning. If you're listening to this on the replay in the old-fashioned format of the traditional podcast through Apple or indeed Spotify, and you do have any questions, Roger will be sharing his contact information towards the end of our conversation this morning. But what I want to do, Roger, you were saying some really interesting stuff that I absolutely never thought about whenever I launched my podcast originally. I'll be completely honest with you. Some of the stuff that you're saying, I never thought about any of those sorts of things. So what you're talking about is really important stuff. It's gold. It's really going to help you as you grow and you build that podcast out. But I want to roll back just if we can for a couple of minutes just to talk a little bit more about something that I thought was so interesting. And again, it ties back to the old marketing customer personas. And whenever we're in marketing, we talk about our ideal customer and we talk about our customer persona. I must admit, I never actually thought about a listener avatar or a listener persona. And that I feel is absolutely critical.
No, it really is. And I think it is critical because consistency in podcasting is a really important factor for success. So I don't know about you, but whenever I tune into a podcast, I want to know roughly what I'm going to get because I'm investing maybe half an hour or an hour of my life. I kind of want to know roughly what it is I'm going to be listening to. And so how do you be consistent? And whenever you're podcasting, if you're on your own, it's actually quite a bit of a lonely pursuit. And it feels a bit weird just talking into a microphone. And if you're just picturing this blur of a sea of faces or ears, potential listeners, it's quite hard to kind of get a handle on that. So I find it really helpful. And to be honest, I didn't come up with the idea. I've stolen it like all my ideas from other people of this ideal listener avatar, where you pick this person and you flesh them out, give them a name, give them characteristics, and then aim your content at them. So I called mine Jeff. So let's say whenever I'm sitting down to record my episode, I'm picturing Jeff, and it's as if I'm having a conversation with him. And that way I know I'm being consistent, and I know that I'm thinking, well, what would Jeff be into? Now, that's a wee bit hard sometimes for people to get their head around because they think, well, my audience is so diverse. How can I just reduce it down to one person? But I find a useful analogy is like an archery board. So if you've got like an archery target, and in the middle you've got your bullseye, your avatar, your ideal listener avatar, is your bullseye. That's where you're aiming. But if you're not very good at archery like myself, you'll probably hit all around the place. But at least if you're aiming in the same direction, you're going to have some form of consistency. So it's not like your podcast is only going to appeal to Jeff or your avatar. You're going to have a much wider audience than that. But it gives you that consistent focus to aim towards, which I think is really, really key.
And do you think then, Roger, you should have, I know in marketing, again, going back to those customer personas, depending on your podcast, you may have several listener avatars.
You certainly, and that question always comes up. That's always the next question I get is, can I have more than one? And I think the answer is, there's no rules with these things. Whatever works for you, works for you. But I think there's a risk that if your avatars are too dissimilar from each other, then it's quite hard to create content that will, if you got, say, 3 avatars and they make up a Venn diagram, the content you're going to be talking about is quite small in the middle. It's kind of a bit difficult to meet all their needs. So I suppose that gives you some thought as to, who am I aiming this towards? If I'm aiming it too broadly, if I'm trying to hit too many targets, then am I going to miss them all? Do you know what I mean? So, but as I said, there's no right or wrong answers, and everyone's podcast is slightly different.
And I think that's the great thing about podcasting as well. It gives you the opportunity to go real niche.
Yeah.
Because there's always going to be a pocket of listeners out there somewhere that has an interest in your topic or your subject,
Yes.
or your experience, or your business. So
Yeah.
it's trying to really find where those people reside, and try to attract them in to the podcast. And I want to talk a little bit more about that later on and pick your brains a little bit further for my own selfish gain this morning when I have you here, actually. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I want to continue on down the path of the equipment. And you mentioned some really good equipment there. And actually the Samson microphone that you mentioned, that's actually where I started off. That was my first purchase, if you like. And I picked those up on Amazon, like you say. I think I bought 2 of them at the time. But again, USB XLR, fantastic, plug and play, get you up and running with Audacity or some other editing software. That's going to hopefully be give you the ability to edit that podcast and maybe start to listen back to it and maybe refine it. What I wanted to talk a little bit about, which is one of the challenges that I spoke to you about recently as well, and I've been sort of struggling with this, particularly making sure that the audio quality is good. And I remember being at a YouTube conference in Dublin a couple of years ago, and a guy called Steve Dotto. And Steve Dotto is a big tech nerd like me and you, YouTuber, always buying equipment, always talking about equipment and ways to do things online. And I remember this has stuck in my mind since then. Steve Dotto said that people will forgive you for poor, shaky cameras, but they will not forgive you for poor, crappy audio.
Yes.
And I was like, wow.
Yeah.
And ever since then, I've been conscious of that whenever I'm producing anything, and I've always been looking for ways to get it better. And yeah, you can go and spend a fortune on a really good quality microphone, but there's actually other things to think about in order to get your audio quality up to par so people actually want to listen into it.
Yeah, totally. And I think the recording environment, if you like, or the space that you record in, is as important, if not more important, than the microphone that you buy. And I was actually in a Facebook group for podcasting yesterday, actually, and someone was complaining about echo in their or what I think what they're referring to as reverb, really, in their recordings, that kind of trail off after your voice, that doesn't sound that nice. And they said, I think I'm going to buy a better mic. And I said to them, no, don't buy a better mic, because if you're recording in an echoey space and you have a £3,000 microphone, it's just going to give you a better reflection of that really bad space. You're just going to hear it better, and you don't want to hear it better. So I suppose there's some things to think about. And the general principle here is sound is it's something that you kind of need to understand how it works, roughly speaking, so that you can actually make a difference here. You don't need to spend a fortune. You don't need to overthink it. But essentially what we're aiming for is that nice, dry studio sound that whenever you turn on your radio and you listen to a radio presenter talking, you have no concept of what space they're recording in. You can't really work it out. If you were to try and picture their studio, you couldn't really picture, is it big, is it small? Because all you're hearing is that direct sound of their voice into their mic, because their space is acoustically treated. Now, we can't replicate recording studios. Most of us can't afford to, nor would we want to, in our houses or wherever we record our podcasts. But there are certain things we can do to kind of make our sound more like that. So sound in a room, whenever you put a microphone in a room and you make a sound, that microphone's going to experience 2 different types of sound. The first is direct sound, which is your mouth to the microphone, straight line, the sound that goes straight to it, and it picks that up first. Then the next type of sound it experiences is indirect sound, the sound that bounces off all the walls, ceilings, floors, surfaces of your room, and then reaches your mic. And because of the nature of physics, it reaches it after the fact. It's taken a longer path. And so what you hear in a very reflective space is this trail off, this kind of echo or reverb after the voice. And it's the equivalent of like reading blurry text. It's kind of audio equivalent of that. The brain needs to focus to kind of decipher what's the actual core raw audio, stripped off from the kind of the room sound, if you like. And it doesn't sound particularly good. It sounds good in music. Often producers will add reverb into, like, say, when Adele, when she goes to record in the studio, there'll be a bit of reverb added. But in spoken word and podcasting, it's the enemy. And like you said, people will forgive you for a shaky camera, but not for dodgy audio. So what we want to do is really reduce the indirect sound and maximize the direct sound. So to maximize the direct sound, we speak closer to our microphone. We basically give the microphone more volume of that direct sound. So up close and personal with your microphone's the first thing. And then we get to the indirect sound. How do we reduce that? Well, we add absorbent surfaces into our room. So a bedroom is actually a really good place to record a podcast because you got a big mattress in there, which is basically a big sound trap. You got a duvet, you maybe got a carpet or a rug, you got curtains, you got a wardrobe full of clothes, and all those things will just suck the energy out of the sound in the room, so it's not bouncing around like mad and giving you lots of indirect sound. Whereas if you're in an office space, then maybe your options are limited because maybe you don't have that many soft furnishings in there. So if you can't bring in extra soft furnishings, then there's some other things you can do. You can think about acoustic panels. So these lovely panels behind me are actually acoustic panels. And basically it's just like foam. It's essentially foam that kind of absorbs that sound energy and stops it bouncing around the room. You can get really cheap ones, kind of maybe like a few quid each on Amazon, or you can spend a bit more, spend a few £100 and get really fancy ones. They all do a very similar job. Or the other thing you can do is hang up acoustic curtains, which is what I actually suggested to yourself, because you're recording actually in a quite a big space. So sometimes it's helpful just to kind of, almost make a smaller space by putting up curtains. But you can do it in very low budget ways. But essentially you're trying to just absorb that sound energy in the room so it's not bouncing around like crazy and getting back to your microphone.
And it's so important as well. And what I would encourage people to do is listen back to your podcasts. That's something that I didn't do a whole lot of. Obviously you listen back to it when you're doing the editing, but even going back through previous episodes, I found I can definitely see and hear a difference.
Yeah.
Through the small improvements that I've made. And that was something that we were talking about in the past couple of weeks, because I had reached out to you and I said, look, how do I improve on this? What can I do? And you were saying to me, look, tell me a little bit more about the room that you're recording in. And I thought that was such an important question. I didn't think a lot about that. And I don't think a lot of people do think about that. They just set up and go for it.
Yeah.
Where if you're recording in too large of a space, that doesn't maybe have that acoustic paneling or those absorbers that you were talking about, you're gonna have those issues with your audio potentially.
Yeah, and if you're listening for this kind of thing, you actually hear it everywhere. So, as an audio nerd, I kind of have I always kind of are picking up on stuff like this. But like if you walk into your bathroom and talk, it sounds like, well, that's why we like singing in the shower, because there's this big long trail off after your voice, this reverberant trail, which is quite flattering to a singing voice. Whereas then if you walk from your bathroom into like your bedroom, whatever, it just sounds totally different. And so whenever you start to listen for these things, then you can walk around your house and go, well, where would be a best place for me to record this thing? If you're not recording video, then you don't need to worry what it looks like. The best sound. Some people actually use like walk-in closets and sit down amongst, with your head in a pile of shirts or something, and or throw a duvet over your head. Some people do that, but whatever works for you. And as I say, you don't need to spend a fortune on it. And actually, I would say, to do a test recording, as you say, and listen back before you start, investing in loads of things. Just have a listen, and we're not looking for perfection here. Sometimes perfection is the enemy of good. But I do think, and I think increasingly though, I think there is an expectation that your audio will be quality. I think in the earlier days of podcasting, when it was maybe a bit more amateur, you maybe could have got away with a bit more. I think now people just expect slightly higher quality, Again, doesn't need to be perfect, but just doesn't, just don't record in your bathroom, basically.
Yeah, at that same conference in Dublin, I remember hearing Brian Fanzo, another content creator who was a speaker at that event, also saying, "Just hit the damn record button."
Yes, that's it.
And I thought, yeah, because you can sort of procrastinate and put all this sort of stuff off, and
Yes.
and I used to be a lot like that. In the very early days, I was very apprehensive of,
Yes.
a lot of people have that imposter syndrome, or they're afraid to put themselves out there, and again, this is what comes with the territory of podcasting, like video content or any other stuff that we do, Roger.
Yeah.
Especially when you're putting yourself out onto a platform like LinkedIn, for example, which we're going out on this morning. People, are going to come in, they're going to comment on it, they're going to they're going to give you some feedback.
Yeah.
Some people might do it publicly, some people might do it privately, and that's all good stuff as well. And maybe don't take it too personally, because we're all on somewhat of a learning journey, as you say.
Exactly.
And this type of stuff only gets better through time. And I always say to people, people ask me about my podcast, like over 60 episodes. It's been going 5 years now. I go back, I go back from time to time and I listen to episode 1 of the podcast, and it was absolutely horrible, Roger. It's like cringeworthy, And I thought to myself, I wonder, should I pull that down and re-record that? And I thought, you know what? No, don't do that, Wayne. Leave it out there.
Yeah.
Because what it shows is progression.
Yes.
And I think that's really important as well, isn't it?
It really is. And like, I don't know if any of your viewers or listeners are aware of Joe Rogan, one of the biggest podcasters in the world. And he started, it's actually not on YouTube anymore, but a few years ago, I found his first podcast, his first live stream. And it is grim. Like, it's him and his mate. They have no idea what they're doing. It's all over the show. It sounds terrible, looks terrible. Now, he sold actually, he didn't sell his podcast. He kind of got an exclusive deal with Spotify for a reported $200 million a couple of years ago. Now, I'm not saying that we're all going to get $200 million from Spotify, but you have to start somewhere. And everyone feels that imposter syndrome. The first time you speak into a microphone and say hello and welcome to the podcast, you feel like you're a little child with like a Fisher-Price microphone in front of you, like you're just pretending. But quickly, after the first few episodes, you'll get the pattern. It'll become more natural, and you'll stop overthinking things.
And the other thing about it as well is a lot of people don't like the sound of their own voice. As well. I remember in the early days when I listened back, I was like sliding into the chair going, "Oh, gee, I can't put that out there." And again, if you're Northern Irish like us, and some of the little sort of sayings that you would use, people would like, and I found myself as well almost being more careful with some of that stuff as well, a little bit. Like, I do a lot of stuff now on U105 on the tech side of things. And I remember in the early days, even going on to that, like I was a bit of a babbling fool, so you do have to put a little bit of thought into it and research into it. And I suppose research is very important in your podcasting approach as well. When you have the opportunity to bring someone on, do a little bit of research around it, use that as a real great opportunity to deep dive into it as well. And as you said at the start of this, adding value, because if you're giving up some of your time, you want to make sure that you're adding value to the listener
totally
as well.
Totally. Like, and one of the brilliant things about podcasting, and I think one of the reasons why it's become so successful, is that it's long form content in a world where all other trends are going towards short form, like TikTok videos. Everything's getting shorter and shorter and shorter because our attention spans are getting really low, and our thumbs love to flick on our phones and get onto that next piece of content. Whereas because podcasting is called a companion medium, it's like you're always doing something else when you're listening to a podcast. Usually, you're going for a run, or you're taking the dog for a walk, or you're doing the dishes or commuting. And it's called they call it passive consumption but active listening. So it's long form content, which means usually whenever you're say you're going for a run or you're on your commute, you don't want to be flipping between episodes back and forward. So you kind of just let a piece of an episode just settle in, and you just listen to it all the way through. And that's really unique now in content. Like, if you put up a Facebook video, you can't really expect anyone to be watching more than 10 seconds of it. That's just the nature of it. Whereas if you put up a podcast episode, the research shows that about 80% of your listeners will listen all the way through, which is just fantastic, which means that you don't have to be gimmicky like you might have to be on YouTube or these other platforms. You don't have to put a hook in at the start and go, oh, wait, I'm going to tell you something amazing at the end. Because people are just more patient with podcasts, they'll just let it listen. And that means that you can deep dive. And so whenever you have a guest on, you don't need to rush it. And you can give these things the time that they deserve. You can talk about concepts that are not just black and white, that have complexity to them. And I think that's really important these days whenever debate and all this kind of stuff gets, well, there's less and less room for debate. It just gets a bit angry. Whereas in the podcast, you can actually really thrash out a concept and let it breathe, give it time. And yeah, do lots of research, obviously. And now we have the benefit of AI and all the things that go along with it. I know we've talked about that, but ChatGPT is a brilliant resource for podcast planning. So like you can go in there, if your guest is anyway well known, you can ask ChatGPT to give you a bio, or you can copy and paste that in. And then you say, well, what questions should I ask this guest on this whatever topic it is? You can get content ideas like that. You can even get sample social media posts to put out to promote the episode, all this kind of stuff, episode title suggestions. The world's very open there in terms of AI. All about that. We've talked about that. In fact, I heard you on U105 talking about the very same topic. It's a great, obviously it's very scary at the same time, but it's a great resource.
Now, tell me a question that I've often wondered when it comes to podcasts, and I know there'll be people who maybe are considering launching a podcast, starting one up. Is there the perfect length? Because people ask that question, how long should it be? Should it be 60 minutes? Should it be 40 minutes? Should it be, and we're talking kind of about the attention span now of the user. And you probably already answered this question, actually, now that I think back to what you've just said. But from your experience, Roger, is there a perfect length that somebody should be aiming for?
No. I think the average length of a podcast is something like 37 minutes, something like that. But we've already mentioned Joe Rogan. His podcasts often go to like 3 hours. You don't have to be short to be popular, to grow an audience. I think at the same time, don't make your podcast longer than it needs to be. Don't fill it with, blabber. It needs to be focused. That's where editing comes in. Don't be afraid to cut a chunk out, cut a question out that you asked your guest if it didn't really fit. Get it as kind of, trim the fat off it as much as you can. But you don't need to stress. If it turns out 45 minutes and you want the 25, that's okay. Don't worry about it. But, if you've only got 25 minutes of good content in a 45-minute interview, don't worry about cutting out the rest as well.
And I suppose the thing is, if you're adding value, people are going to want to stick around.
Correct.
If you're dropping real good information, it's really valuable to the listener. You've done your research, you've done your homework. People are going to want to stick around. And that's the beauty of podcasting. I mean, I love it. I mean, I do a lot of driving and I frequently ask people, give me your I'm going on a long drive to Cork or Galway. Give me some recommendations of podcasts that I should be listening to. And I just get into the car and I just soak it all up. So if it's good content, people are going to want to stick around. Now let's talk a little bit. I've got 2 questions in at the moment that we're going to come back to, which I think are really interesting. So thank you guys for popping in those questions. I'm gonna hold on to Roger for a little bit longer. Hopefully we'll get some more really valuable information out of him today. But I want to talk a little bit about the distribution of the podcast, because that's really important. Getting this, because there's a lot of different podcasting platforms out there. I mean, you mentioned Apple earlier on, which is one of the more well-known ones that people would be familiar with. There's also Spotify. You mentioned Joe Rogan and his podcast Exclusive Deal over on Spotify, which again is a platform that I use as well. But there are other smaller, lesser known. I know Amazon's got into the business recently. I know Google's got into the business as well. Can you give people a little bit of a flavor, Roger, on where they should be distributing the podcast to, and maybe how that happens?
Yeah, and this is something that I think confuses people a little bit about podcasting, because we're more used to the likes of, say, YouTube. So let's take YouTube as an example. If I said to you, you need to get a video up on YouTube, what do you do? Well, you would go to youtube.com, you would hit upload, you would put your video file in there. And then how would people find your video? They would go to youtube.com and there it would be. It's a very centralized system and everything's in the one place under the one company. Podcasting is a decentralized system, which means that people don't consume podcasts on podcasting.com. There is no podcasting.com that gives you podcasts. They consume it, as you said, on Apple Podcasts, on Google, on Amazon Music, Spotify, all these different places, a whole host of different places. And so then the question is, well, how do I get my podcast in all those places? And do I need them in all those places? So first of all, I would say, yes, you want to put your podcast out as wide as you can get it. So how do you get them to those places? Well, you need what's called a podcast host provider. So if you're familiar with web hosts, i.e. The people that kind of run the servers where your website exists on, it's a similar model. So podcast hosts are the people that run the servers that your audio files sit on. So they manage the kind of the distribution. And then they can actually then point your podcast to all the different apps and directories that people use to consume your podcast. So in a good podcast host, they'll have a little interface where they'll have all the different apps and directories, and then you can just go link, and you link them all up. Sometimes there's a wee bit of a process or a form to fill in and that kind of thing. I think Apple is probably the most laborious in terms of getting linked into them, but it doesn't take that long. And then once you've done that, just once, whenever you've set up your podcast in the first place, then every time you upload a new episode, it gets pushed out to all those apps and directories. So you don't have to do that every time. You just do it once whenever you're getting your podcast all set up with your podcast host. You tell your host where you want it to go and do all that process, and then it'll just go there every time. Now, that can be in some podcast hosts, and they're getting better, but some podcast hosts don't actually make that process easy for you. The one that I use and recommend is Buzzsprout. There are others. Spotify bought a podcast host called Anchor, and now they changed the name. It's now just called Spotify for podcasting, or podcasting with Spotify, or something. I can't even remember what it's called. It's free. I wouldn't really recommend it too much because it's very Spotify centric, and they just really want your audio on Spotify and not really anywhere else, ideally for them. But there's other ones like Buzzsprout or Libsyn or Podbean or Captivate. There's a whole number of them. They do a fairly similar job. And I think Buzzsprout's about $12 a month, something like that. So they're not a huge cost, but they make the process of uploading and distributing your podcast audio very straightforward. And that's the main thing. So it just kind of works.
Now, a big shout out to another fellow podcaster today, Peter Doak. Peter's listening in this morning. He says his first podcast, or episode 1, was dreadful. And he's now at episode 74. He says it's still dreadful, but I think Peter's being a wee bit hard on himself. I'm sure it's got better. In fact, I've listened into Peter's podcasts, and they have been, like my own, getting steadily better. But hopefully, Peter, you're finding the tips that Roger is sharing this morning helpful and useful. And again, do definitely connect with Roger if you haven't already done on LinkedIn. He's a fantastic guy, very approachable, very easy to ask questions to relating to podcasting. But we do have a question in from Harry, and it kind of links in nicely to what you were talking about a couple of moments ago. And should he be considering a paid podcasting host or a free podcast provider? That's a very interesting question, because you're talking about Buzzsprout, and I know they do have a free tier, but they also have paid tiers. And I used to use Buzzsprout, and I moved from them recently. And I'll tell you why I moved first, and you can tell me what your thoughts on that was. I wanted to actually create more podcasts.
Yes.
And Buzzsprout were kind of pigeonholing me into,
right.
You got to take another subscription.
Correct.
And then I was speaking to a few people, and they said, oh, actually, there's one or two other providers you can take a look at, Wayne, and they actually allow you to run multiple podcasts as well.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really good. And there wasn't much of a difference in the price. But we'll go back to the original question that Harry actually asked. Paid or free in your professional opinion, Roger?
There's no right or wrong answer. My general feeling on these things is if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. So in some ways, Okay, so I was talking about podcasting being this decentralized open system, right? That is the secret sauce of podcasting. That's why it's so brilliant. That's why it survived this long, because it's not linked to one company, right? It's not owned by one company. It's this open source. There's really a standard. RSS is the kind of standard, the kind of tech behind it. Now, that's great because it means that no one can tell you where you need to go to listen to podcasts. No one can tell you where you need to put your podcast. It's very open. Now, Spotify have got big into podcasting. They've invested more than $1 billion in podcasting, and their CEO Daniel Ek said it's a $20 billion opportunity for them, right? But they are not interested in the open aspect of podcasting. They would rather everyone just came to Spotify to listen to podcasts. That's why they do so many exclusive deals with the likes of celebrities and Joe Rogan. They pay people huge amounts of money to only put their podcast on Spotify. The reason I mention that is because they own the biggest free podcasting host, right? So you can go to Spotify, host your podcast with them, and it won't cost you a thing. Now, if you have zero money in the bank and that's all you can do, that's no problem. It'll still work. You can still get your podcast in other places. But in general, I'm not a huge supporter of Spotify and how they see podcasting, because they want to close it all down. They actually want to get rid of the RSS framework and the structure and the standard that really podcasting is built on. They say it's outdated and we don't need it anymore. Of course, they would say that because it means that they can pull everyone into their Spotify platform and your podcast won't be anywhere else. So yes, it'll work. If you go to them, host your podcast with them, no problem. It'll work in a very similar way to Buzzsprout works. I'm just not a huge fan. I'm not a huge fan of these free products in general. I think I'd rather spend a little bit of money and get some really nice features with the likes of Buzzsprout. Now, what you were talking about, why you moved from Buzzsprout, I was interested to hear why you moved, because I haven't heard of many people moving away, but I totally understand your reason, which is, I suppose, quite unique to you in that you want to run multiple podcasts. Now, most people are in the kind of one podcast or no podcast category. And then it doesn't make much of a difference. If you do go into more than one podcast, yes, there are different pricing models in other podcast hosts that might make it more economically viable to go with them. So I totally get that. You can't go too far wrong really with a podcast host. They all do a very similar job, but I would recommend spending a little bit of money, going to the likes of Buzzsprout, Libsyn, Captivate, Podbean, these ones, and maybe stray away from Spotify. I don't like the spirit of where they're coming from when it comes to the podcasting.
And that's a great overview on what's out there, Roger, as well. And again, there's plenty of variety and there's plenty of choice, from a small monthly subscription to potentially what you may need in terms of the analytics as well, which is a really important component as well. Having analytics is important, and paying attention to your analytics as well. And that actually leads nicely into the next question from Julie. These are good questions, actually.
Yeah.
I really like these. And Julie had asked, how do we get more listeners? That's, I suppose, a question that we've all asked and scratched our head time and time again. And I'm at this at the moment with YouTube. How do I get more subscribers on YouTube? And I'm really, I'm tormenting myself at the moment about what should I be doing. I'm looking at YouTube Shorts. I've started to produce some of them. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but from a podcasting perspective, how does one get more listeners? How do you attract more people into your podcast, right? How do you get people tuning in, listening in, hitting the subscribe button, which is really important as well, so that whenever you do release a new podcast, they get that notification. And it's something that I think people should be encouraging within their podcasts. Get people to subscribe, get people to follow, so that when you do release a new episode, they get notified and it brings them back in. But how do we get more listeners?
Yeah, we could talk for an hour on that alone, I think. And those Facebook groups that I mentioned for podcasting are just littered with people coming on going, how do I get more listeners? I think the first thing I would say is don't get too caught up in your numbers, particularly at the start of your podcasting journey. The whole build it, if I build it, they will come. Psychology just doesn't work. It takes time. What you're building is an audience, but actually what you're building is habits in people. You want people to habitually come and consume your content, and that takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. And if you put out your first podcast and your mum listens to it and that's it, that's fairly normal. Don't stress about it. Don't worry about it. It takes, you're talking a medium term plan, at least with podcasting. It takes a year or two to start building podcasts. And if you talk to these ones that get millions of downloads, very often their kind of growth chart is very shallow at the start. And maybe a year in, they're still only getting a 100 or 200 listens an episode. And then, very quickly, there's a kind of a tipping point at some stage, and then they kind of hit it big. That won't happen to all podcasts. But I think the main point I would come to is it all comes down to content. You can spend a fortune. And there's a very uncouth phrase, you can't polish a turd. But basically, if your podcast content isn't great, then it's going to be very expensive for you to market that, because it's an uphill struggle. If you create value, if your podcast and any kind of content you're putting out is adding value for people, then it's an easy sell. You don't have to convince people to listen, because it's going to help them. So that's where you start. You start with your content. We're going to take that as a given. Then you've got amazing content. You're giving away gold every episode. What then can you do? Well, you mentioned asking people to subscribe. So that's called a call to action. So you want to put call to actions in all your content. So you don't want to end an episode and not tell people what to do next. So what do you want them to do next? Is it to subscribe to your podcast? You might want to say, hit that follow button wherever you get your podcasts. Is it you want them to maybe sign up to your mailing list? An email mailing list is a great way of keeping people, keeping you on their radar. So you can keep on maybe feeding little bits of content or a summary of the podcast you put out recently or whatever. And that'll kind of remind people to kind of look for you again. And then there's a kind of term, a multi-platform approach, which is basically a fancy way of saying, don't just think about your podcast as an audio-only resource. Can you take little snippets of it, make little video snippets? You can use tools like Headliner is one, or Wave is another. These are free tools where you can actually create a little video clip with maybe a dynamic waveform of your audio and put that up on TikTok, put it up on Facebook, on Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever your audience is, and use those different platforms and think, what's the best way of me sharing my podcast content and repurposing it in lots of different ways? So can you turn your episode into a blog article? And this is where AI comes in, because in fact, Buzzsprout have just added in an AI tool to their platform called Co-Host. It's a little bit of an extra subscription. I think it's $10 a month. And it gives you an auto transcription of your podcast when you put it up. It gives you 5 episode titles, suggestions. And it'll give you a little description of your episode. It'll give you chapter markers, what you said when. And you can also then ask it questions and say, well, get me a section where I talked about this, or get me the best section where this happened. And then you can repurpose that content. So your podcast episode could turn into a blog. It could turn into a few kind of dynamic waveform, those little video snippets. You could create quote graphics. So say your guest said something really profound, picture their face, what they said, put that up on Instagram. So you're trying to think about all those different platforms. Now, don't knock your pan in and spend hours and hours and hours and hours at this. It can get really, really time consuming. So only commit what you can commit to it, and don't stress, just give it time to grow. But in general, as with all these things, there's an 80-20 rule. And sometimes people say in podcasting, the 20% is your time that you actually spend creating your content, and the 80% is the marketing. So you do have to allow some time to put into that marketing, to shouting about your podcast, to telling people about it. Otherwise, you'll have a harder time in getting it to grow. But be patient with yourself. It will grow eventually. Just give it time, and if you do all the right things, then hopefully over time you'll grow an audience that will be very loyal and keep coming back for more.
Now, practicing as you preach, if you are listening to this podcast on the replay and you haven't yet done it, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because I don't want you to miss out on any of these episodes. And this is a fantastic episode today. We were really deep diving into getting your podcast up and running. And again, a lot of what you're saying there, Roger, is kind of circling back around to what we talked about at the start about the listener avatar, about researching your content. And again, if you're creating real good value in that content, people are going to want to stick around, people are going to want to tune in, and they're going to want to listen. But I want to sort of round our conversation off this morning, and I could talk about this stuff for much, much longer because I've got such an interest in it. And I think people who are genuinely interested in podcasting, I know Peter's listening in this morning, who's got his own podcast, is definitely going to take away lots of real good stuff from this episode. But the podcasting has been around for a while now. A lot of people are launching their podcasts. Spotify's got in on the action. You're seeing huge players in the market at the moment. You know, I'm talking about content creators here, Joe Rogan and these types of guys who have amassed huge amount of listeners. There's hope for me yet, Roger. Spotify might reach out. They might sign me up.
They might be watching this right now, Wayne.
They might be doing that. I'm not looking 12 million like Meghan Markle. You know, a couple of grand, you know, would tie me over nicely. So if you're listening in Spotify, check out the episodes of the podcast. But let's say we've got somebody listening in, you know, and they're thinking, is it too late? Look, is it too late for me to get on it now? Is it too late? And I often reflect back on that particular question, Roger, to YouTube. And I kind of alluded to it a couple of moments ago, where I'm really trying to drive up my subscribers, going, damn, I wish I had got onto YouTube earlier. Why didn't I not jump on this YouTube thing and get in early and try to really drive this forward? Now I'm having to circle back around and, you know, put more effort into it and energy into it. You know, there's lots of platforms out there. There's TikTok, there's Instagram, there's Snapchat, there's YouTube, you know, there's lots of stuff. Is it too late? Is the market too saturated? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a question I get asked lots, and I think it's because we hear about podcasts all the time now. It seems to be, well, maybe it's just because I'm in a really geeky world that everyone talks to me about podcasts, but it seems to me that they're everywhere. But it's actually really not oversaturated, the market. There's about, depending on what way you measure it, about 3 or 4 million podcasts in the world. But actually, in terms of active podcasts that are actively putting out content, say in the last like 90 days, there's less than 1 million. Right, that still seems like quite a lot. You may think, oh, there's 1 million active podcasts out there. Why does the world need mine? But if you look at other numbers to put that in context, I think there's about something like 51 million YouTube channels. You know, there's, I think, maybe about 39 million of them active. There's about 600 million blogs in the world. So we're still talking small fry for podcasting. This is the start of the journey. Starting a podcast now is probably like launching a blog in 2001. You know, there was a couple of million of them about, and people were talking about it being oversaturated then, but there was a huge spike to come. And that is, I think that's where we're at podcasting. Obviously, increasingly, it's hard to predict where the future of tech is going to go. Maybe we'll all be on hoverboards and holograms in a few years. Who knows? But you know, I think the journey, if you look at the kind of lifespan of podcasting, I think we're very much at the beginning. And the amount of money that is being pumped into it by these big media companies is insane. And they don't pump money into stuff to watch it fail. You know, there's a lot of skin in the game in these companies to actually make podcasting, you know, have a long life and make it and you know, make it go on for a number of years. So we're very much at the beginning of the journey. If you haven't started now, it's a great time to start and get stuck in.
And I heard something last week on social media. One of the local-ish, Northern Ireland-ish program directors for one of the well-known radio stations here in Northern Ireland commented in relation to it's the digital podcasting element that's really helping drive traffic again back around to the traditional radio. So you're seeing these, you know, large media outlets in Northern Ireland really tapping into the power of podcasting and making snippets or episodes of their traditional radio show available in the digital format that people can tune into. And again, it drives people back around. It piques their interest in a particular show or presenter. And then you're back to listening to the traditional radio in your car then. That makes perfect sense. But I've got another question in here from Alex, Roger. I'm just going to throw this at you. I know we're over time here, but look, it's class. And she wants to know how often. Like should you be doing one episode a month? Should you be doing an episode every week? Does that really depend? Is there an optimum?
I feel like I'm always saying there's no right answer. It's just really probably not very satisfactory. All right. Okay. Here's my thinking on this. So do it as often as you can sustainably continue to do it. I'd say consistency is more important than frequency when it comes to podcasting. Because as I mentioned before, what you're trying to do is build a habit in your listeners. You want them to kind of regularly tune in and go, hang on, it's been a couple of weeks since the last one, and another one must be due, and check in that way. If all you can do is monthly or quarterly or whatever it is, then do that. Don't knock your pan in and then, pod fade, as they say, where you basically can't keep on doing it. You don't have the time or the motivation to keep going. Kind of set your pace at something you can manage and then keep going at that pace. I would say that any less frequently than monthly, you're going to run the risk of people forgetting about you because they'll have listened to too many other podcasts in between. But as I said, whatever you can do, if you can do weekly, brilliant. A weekly podcast is harder work than it might sound, because there is research, there is logistics, there is editing, there is marketing to do. But do what you can do. Now, there's a little trick that you can use called using series or seasons, which is if you think that you would like to go out quite regularly, say you maybe want to do a weekly podcast, but you know that you can't sustain that, then put it out in seasons. So say I'm launching season 1, it's going to be 12 episodes. And then we're going to take a break over the summer and we'll be back in the autumn with season 2. That means that you can batch record. Say you take a run up and you batch record your episodes, do it in a whole, just don't do anything else. Just all you do is your podcast for a couple of weeks, record all those, get it done in advance, schedule them out on your weekly basis. And then now you've got time while those are being put out and just drip to your audience to then work on season 2 in your own time. And it's sustainable then. So you can even do a batch of 6 if that's all you can manage. And that way it's frequently enough that people will actually, get that habit, know when it's going to come. But then there's a break so that you can actually plan and prepare and rest for the next season.
I love that one. And by the way, that's what I'm going to do on my next podcast. I've got one in the mix that we're working on that we're going to launch, and it's going to be in seasons. That's the way I'm going to do it, because I am guilty. I have been guilty as charged with my current podcast where I've fallen off the horse a couple of times. And when I look back through the episodes, do you know what it's been, Roger? I've got busy with other stuff and I haven't been able to allocate the time to it. And I remember looking back now, this isn't last year, but maybe a year before, there was it was bad, and you're not going to be happy with this. There was 2 episodes in 12 months. I could see the horror in your face right now.
But I'm sure they were brilliant episodes.
But that and that's what I got preoccupied. I got busy with other stuff, and it kind of fell to the back burner, and it just didn't happen. And again, you're right. You're trying to gear that up again. You've dropped out of people's radar. They forgot about you. There's other podcasts out there, and you do want to. And I think the seasons idea and tip is fantastic, and that's definitely the way that I'm going to do it with the next podcast. Roger, we have covered a lot of ground today in this episode. It's I'm going to be honest, it's been one of my better episodes because of the value that you've brought to the listener, the tips that you've shared, your experience, and really you've gave people a good overview if you're considering. I know, again, going back to Peter, who's listening and who is a podcaster himself, he's been taking away information, as have I. Now, you mentioned earlier on that you do training in this space. So if people want to find out a little bit more information about the types of training that you deliver, how can they find out about that? But also, how can they get in touch with you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on Facebook. You can find me, just search for my name. I also have a website called castmastery.co.uk, Castmastery, where you can go and drop me a message there and find out a little bit more about the stuff I do. And if it is training that you want, then I have courses that I can direct you to. Or if it's more kind of in-depth consultancy, I can also offer that as well. I also do a bit of editing and producing of other people's podcasts. So trying to tick as many boxes as I can, help people in any way that I can.
And that's a really good point. The podcasting's a lot of work. Let's be honest. It's especially on the editing side of it, and that in itself is a huge steep learning curve. So if you can outsource that,
correct.
And I do a lot of outsourcing in my own business. Look, there's stuff that I don't like to do, and I outsource it to people who are much more experienced than I am, do a much better job than I would ever do. So don't don't be hard on yourself trying to learn all of these things. If you're comfortable and your skill is delivering of the content in terms of chatting with your guests and that type of stuff, maybe hand that stuff off. And again, reach out to you, Roger. You're more than happy to have a conversation with people if they've got questions, if there's something
Definitely.
that you feel that you might be able to help them with. It's really important to reach out, isn't it?
Yeah, like you, Ian, I could talk about this stuff all day. So if anyone wants to chat, just reach out.
Excellent. Well, look, Roger, once again, it's been fantastic to have this conversation with you. Again, please keep in touch with me. I'm going to be making all of the stuff that you referenced in the show notes available as well, some of the tools that you mentioned as well. And if you are listening into this podcast on the replay and you would like to find out a little bit more information about getting started in podcasting, please do reach out to Roger. Get in touch with them. Again, LinkedIn's probably a great platform to do that. I want to thank everybody who listened in today, those people who fielded in some great questions. I have a couple of more questions, but I'm not going to hold up Roger any longer. I'm going to suggest that you reach out to him directly on those questions. And also keep an eye out for another episode of the podcast coming your way very soon.